the country grapples with the challenges of the national grid meeting South Africa's energy demands, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy has set up its sight on building additional nuclear capacity, which will be able to supply as much as 2,500 megawatts of additional power to the country's grid. Now, the department has requested information to commence the preparations for a nuclear build program. Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe has announced plans for expanded investment at the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa. Joining us now to unpack these complexities is David Nicholls, who is a member of the board of NECSA. David, thanks very much for your time and welcome to the AM report. Perhaps as a start, in previous years, government had kind of cautioned against adding additional capacity through nuclear energy, citing mostly, cost considerations, saying it was too costly. What's changed since then?
Well, I think nothing's really changed since then, except that what happened then was there was a presumption on what the costs and the funding difficulties would be. And the reality now is that the government's gone out with a request for information to try and get the market to come back with what is the real costs. And I would just like to correct one thing you said earlier. You mentioned the idea of additional power from a nuclear program. I think it's important to understand that the crisis that we're going to face as a country from the late 2020s onwards is going to be the decommissioning of Eskom's existing coal fleet. They were all built 30, 40 years ago, and they're all coming out of service because of a number of issues. Primarily, they're basically too old to keep running. In the late 2020s, early 2030s, they start coming out of service. So unless we build something in this country, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we're going to have less and less power available to power the grid.
Yeah, and why is that something nuclear? Why is that the best option to go for, unless that's not what you're suggesting?
Oh, I clearly I've been in the nuclear business myself since the 70s. But essentially, the issue is that if you're going to replace the current dispatchable baseload plant that we have that feeds heavy industry, then your problem is going to be that you've got to decide how you're going to do it. And there's four ways you can make power essentially in the world on a large scale that's been proven. One is coal, one is hydro, one is gas, and one is nuclear. And the real problem in this country is that we've got lots of coal, but that's being increasingly difficult to imagine we can go on using. We've got no hydro in country. We've got no gas in country at the moment. There may be some, but there's been about to find natural gas. Or you've got nuclear, which we've got a 30, 40-year history with. So the answer is it's a real option on the table, and we should find out what it costs to do. All the indications are that the integrated cost of a nuclear program, that's both the cost of funding it, because you get finance with the deal, and the cost of operation, would make it a highly competitive option in the country. And as one joke used to read on a bumper sticker, that solar's all right, but nuclear works all night.
That's quite interesting. Obviously, there's also other things taking place in the backdrop. The Minister, Gwede Mantashe, sort of entertaining plans for an expanded investment in NECSA. That's the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa. But this is despite previous financial losses of the entity in and of itself. Why should South Africans believe that this would be money well spent, given that?
I think the NECSA situation is quite interesting. Clearly, I was only appointed in January this year. But essentially, NECSA has been hit by a number of issues over the last few years. And the biggest issue, financially, was the closure of our radioisotope production facility by the regulator. And that knocked about R1 billion out of our bottom line over the last 2 years. Clearly, COVID-19 is not helping us either. But essentially, NECSA has a number of activities, some of which are purely commercial, and some of which are a state accountability, like managing the radioactive issues coming from the previous programs in the country, which we can't ignore. And the other one clearly is technical in terms of research and development. So, short answer is yes, NECSA's lost money on its books over the last few years, but actually it's sitting here now with a situation where we have no bank debt at the moment. We need additional sources of income over the next couple of years. We have plans we presented to the Portfolio Committee a month or so ago, and we believe that there is a viable route to NECSA being a competitive commercial activity with a limited state funding to support those activities which are state activities.
All right, and of course, for many people who, for lack of a better term, aren't following the nuclear story quite closely, as soon as you mention nuclear energy, you kind of take them back to the years of former President Jacob Zuma, conversations around Russian interference and how that possibly opened the door to some kind of dodgy dealing, to put it broadly. Do you think we've done enough to use a common term, sanitize the narrative around nuclear in the country and ensure that at the very least, there's widespread buy-in in the country moving towards that direction insofar as energy procurement is concerned?
I think there's two issues here. The first issue, you took the past. Now, clearly, I was ESCOM's chief nuclear officer up until 2 years ago. And so I was on the other side of that process. And as far as I'm concerned, the media statements bore little relation to what was going on the ground. We publicly stated, and the RFI said it, that it had been open tender. I kept being asked, where is the Russian deal? And I said, I don't know of a Russian deal. And they said, you're lying, you see. So please tell us about the Russian deal. So I couldn't win that argument because either I told them there was a deal, which there wasn't, or I was accused of lying. So that's a bit sort of behind us. I think that what we're seeing now is the fact that nuclear has been on the agenda for South Africa to commit to from 2010. And it's continually been opposed by the anti-lobby, and you could ask what the rationale is. And I will ask a different question. Why are people objecting to South Africa issuing a request for information? Because if you believe that nuclear makes no sense and is too expensive and there's no model that would make it work for the country, then having information to prove that won't hurt. Probably the answer is that you don't want to hear the news that says, actually we can fund it. And we can fund it at a very competitive rate because it's like many things. The funding costs drive it. And therefore there is a drive to stop the discussion because it closes the door to other activities which make money for people.
That's interesting. Once again,